Welcome to Riding Counsel with Rich Jaffe, where the open road meets expert advice. I'm Richard Jaffe, an attorney and biking enthusiast, and this is the podcast where we dive into the world of motorcycling, safety, culture, charitable giving, and riding right. So, whether you're a seasoned rider or just getting started, let's talk bikes, the road, and everything in between. Let's ride! What's up, everybody out there in ridingcounsel.com podcast land? So my name is Rich Jaffe, and let me tell you something. Some motorcycle accident cases look like slam dunks, clear liability, serious injuries, and the law is actually on the rider's side. So why do some of these cases still lose in court? I'm going to tell you that because today we're pulling back the curtain on the uncomfortable truth about motorcycle accident litigation, how bias, bad assumptions, missing evidence, human psychology, all this can quietly kill even strong cases. If you represent riders, or simply want to understand how justice really works when motorcycles are involved, this is an episode you don't want to miss. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. My name is Rich Jaffe. I am a personal injury attorney, mostly doing motorcycle accidents. I am a podcaster, and I am a motorcycle enthusiast, and I'm here to give you some information, hopefully, that you will find helpful. And I'm here with my good friend Million, who is going to be talking about this stuff with me. How you doing today, Million?
I am doing well. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. And I know we're talking slam dunks, which maybe people overestimate a little bit, but we're going to find out, man.
All right. Well, listen, I'm going to give you one slam dunk for right now. If you smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, share this podcast. I want this information to get out there because so much is misunderstood out there, especially with respect to motorcycles and legal cases. And I got to tell you, every ride starts before you even get on the bike. So hopefully this information is going to help you. I think I have some really good information for you today. So, let's get into it. So I don't know, Million, how do you feel about this stuff?
In my estimation, the only time you really bring in an attorney for a lawsuit is if you think you have a slam dunk case. Otherwise, why would you do it? Well, in this situation, it's really no different. But when people hear that term, they say strong motorcycle accident case. Looks like a slam dunk at first, but why do people perceive right away that it is a slam dunk? What makes them think that?
Okay, so one or two things happen here when people think they have a slam dunk case. First, they're hurt really bad. Okay, and I never want to see that happen. But if you're hurt really bad, and just because you're hurt really badly in a motorcycle accident case doesn't mean necessarily that you have a case, because somebody has to be responsible for those injuries. And if the responsible party is yourself, you're going to have a really hard time suing yourself. So there's not somebody to sue if the fault is yours. The second thing that happens is there's really good liability. Liability is the who did something wrong part of the case. So if somebody hits you from behind, it sounds really strong because clearly it's their fault. But if you're not hurt from that accident, well, what are you going to be suing for? So yeah, this person behind you is at fault, but there's no case because there's nothing to sue for. So usually one of those two things happen.
So when these cases start to progress, so someone will come to you, they get a case. Now there's all these different stages. You get your initial things you have to handle. You have your discovery things. Then we get into investigations and pre-trials and juries. At which point in this process do you normally see these cases start to come apart?
Well, a lot of times it comes apart from the beginning. So it's really unfortunate to say, but as soon as a police officer hears, okay, there's a motorcycle accident, unless that police officer is a rider, him or herself, a lot of times there's a bias against motorcycles. So it doesn't show up where the police officer will write in a report blatantly, well, the motorcyclist must have been speeding because they had red wheels and they were on a sport bike. But it's a little more subtle than that. And, there's codes that are around a police report that indicate possible reasons for fault, or they'll say, a motorcyclist was, traveling at a fast rate of speed by judging, the skid marks or some other kind of little subtle hint of the fact that the motorcyclist was responsible. And, it's it's typical of almost everybody who doesn't ride. They have a slight prejudice against motorcyclists to
Yeah.
begin with, and they identify with drivers because, most people drive and don't ride a motorcycle, right? There's a few 100,000 motorcyclists across the country, but there's millions and millions of drivers of vehicles, motor vehicles.
Yes.
So when you can identify easily with somebody who is driving a car versus driving a motorcycle, that's gonna that's gonna cause some prejudice.
We discussed in the past episodes about how, for instance, police officers, a lot of them do ride. It's, there's motorcycle police and all that.
Right.
And when we see I guess, the bias along the way, how, in your experience and what you've seen, how biased are attorneys against motorcyclists, judges, jurors, going down the line of this whole process? Where is there a place where you see the most bias, or jurors pretty biased? Like, what does that look like to you?
Well, it certainly does make it difficult to dispel any bias when I am representing somebody who's riding a sport bike with, very nice, red wheels and a lot of modifications to the motorcycle to make it go fast. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they were going fast when the accident happened.
Mm,
So you really do have to dispel this stuff. You have to diffuse it. And a lot of that is done in jury selection. So you
mm,
can't really tell a juror what to think when you're selecting a jury, but there are certain questions that you could pose in the alternative that really kind of hopefully makes them think about things a little more carefully. But you definitely have to probe that stuff in jury selection. That's for sure. You're going to find it in other areas too. Judges, not so much because judges have seen
mm.
their fair share of motorcycle accident cases. But and attorneys, well, they have a job. They have a job to do, right? Mine is to diffuse and dispel any kind of bias or prejudice against motorcyclists. And on the other side, there's a defense attorney who's working just as hard as I am in trying to put that in the juror's mind. So, there's a lot of battling of contentions, of thoughts there. But when it comes to things like a witness, well, now you're talking a lot of bias because if they see a motorcycle go by, they're going to think that motorcycle was speeding. And it's really based not on science, not on actual measurements or something like a radar gun. It's based upon what they think because they see a motorcyclist, which is smaller than a motor vehicle and it has less lights than a motor vehicle. So it takes them a little more time with their brain processing these things to actually judge the speed of a motorcycle. It's like if somebody dropped a pen or something like that in the middle of the road versus like a really large truck. The truck is so much easier to see and identify with respect to speed than it is a motorcycle. So, yeah, there are a lot of things that are not based upon science that come into play here, unfortunately. And all these biases and prejudices, they can add up if you don't diffuse and dispel them immediately.
Could you drill a little deeper into the jury selection? I'm very curious about this because I understand both sides will have to determine who ultimately becomes the jury. I would assume you're able to ask, "Hey, are you a motorcycle rider? Are you in a bike club?" And based on the numbers, it's not, like you said, not as common, more car drivers than motorcyclists. But how would you kind of filter that? I would assume if you find someone that is a biker, you would indeed try to get them on the jury. So how does that process work?
Well, in jury selection, usually if there's only one party on the plaintiff side and one party on the defendant side, there's two lawyers who come into a room and they conduct what's known as voir dire, and it's a fancy name for jury selection. And voir dire is essentially questioning the jury. So there's a panel of people that come in, 20 or 30 people, depending upon the jury availability. And out of that panel, sometimes six people, sometimes eight people are seated in the very front. And we ask questions of those potential jurors. And what we're really doing is if you're a talented lawyer, well, your main goal of jury selection is to make sure that you get people who are fair and impartial. Okay, those are the key words there, fair and impartial. So if there's something that keeps them from being fair and impartial, that will just distract them from the law, distract them from the facts so much that they cannot really be fair and impartial, then they would not really be a proper juror for this particular case. Doesn't mean they're a bad person, but maybe they're better off on a criminal matter, maybe they're better off on a contract matter. But let's say somebody, was involved in a motorcycle accident and they're seated in the first six, and I'm asking them questions, and they're going to sit there and say, I don't care what the law says. I don't care what, uh, the facts are. I can tell you that all motorcyclists are always free of fault. Well, that's probably not a good juror for this case. And they would probably be excluded or challenged, if you will, to get off the jury, and they would not sit on the jury. But when you have people who actually can be fair and impartial, then you got to dive in a little deeper and ask some questions that may plant some seeds in their brain to make them think. So let me give you an example.
Mm.
Usually, what I do is I ask the panel in the very beginning, the 20 or 30 people, I say, by a show of hands, how many people think there are fraudulent cases out there, that are in the juries or in the judicial system that really don't belong? And almost everybody raises their hands. Oh, yeah, there's a lot of fraud out there, because, insurance companies, unfortunately, have done a really good job making people think that all personal injury cases are fraudulent. But then I ask another question of them to try to get them to think. I ask them, how many people think there are frivolous defenses out there? And people start to think. They don't raise their hand too quickly, but they say, yeah, I guess there could be frivolous defenses. And then they start raising their hand. So, on one hand, they recognize the fact that they've been programmed by television, by TV, well, television, TV, same thing, but television or newspapers or the internet or social media, that there's so much fraud out there. But then they start thinking about fraudulent defenses. So, it's kind of a switch, and they now understand that they've been programmed, and they really do have to keep an open mind.
I would assume too that if you can find out if they have some motorcycle knowledge as well, whether even if they don't ride, if they just know about motorcycles in the process, it probably helps your case as well.
Yeah, that definitely does help. Some jurors, their only familiarity with motorcycles are the people who split lanes, or that pass red lights, or even travel in packs and do things that they're not supposed to. That's their only exposure, and you really have to flesh that out when you're talking to a potential juror. But if somebody does ride a motorcycle, well, sure, that's something that probably is in our favor, but you still have to flesh that out, because if they rode a motorcycle and they had a bad experience for some reason, then you still have to, ask them the proper questions. But certainly they're going to be more familiar with reaction times and what you can do with your body and your feet at the same time. So those are the type of people who, if I'm representing a motorcycle accident victim, yeah, I would want them on the jury. The closer the jury is to your client, the more that they're going to identify and probably be more sympathetic towards your client. So you really have to try to weed the people out who are not familiar with motorcycles, not really similar to your client.
I would also think, as you said a second ago, about how do they feel about like splitting lanes and so on and so forth, just due to the fact that there's so many more car drivers than motorcycle drivers, it's just more likely that this would be an opinion. But, people say, oh, I didn't see the motorcycle, because that comes up all the time. We've discussed that before. We're doing that bias thing where we're sort of trying to shift the blame a little bit. So how does that phrase, when someone says, well, I didn't see the motorcycle, how's that blame shifting without, like bringing in negligence to this whole thing?
Well, unfortunately, that is a very common cause of motorcycle accidents, when defendants say, I did not see the motorcyclist before the accident. And it's probably not that they didn't see the motorcyclist, it's that their brain was not programmed such that it registered that there's a motorcyclist in front of them, because a motorcycle usually has one big headlight. They may have the little smaller ones, but they have one big headlight, as opposed to something like two headlights of a car. Or it's the profile of the motorcycle itself that is so much thinner when somebody says they didn't see the motorcyclist before the accident than a car usually is about 8 feet wide. A motorcycle is what, maybe 2.5 feet wide. So it shares a profile that's much different than a motor vehicle. So that's something, of course, that I would like to plant into the brain of jurors, that they didn't see the motorcycle before, and that kind of means that they haven't been keeping a proper lookout. But the defense is going to start saying, well, you didn't see him because the lights weren't working on the motorcycle, or the guy was going so fast, of course you didn't see him. something of that nature. So, you might think you have a really good case coming into the trial, but then you're going to run into jurors who maybe they aren't as honest as they should be in jury selection, and they have an axe to grind because they got screwed over by an attorney or a judge, or maybe even in their own case, and they're going to say, okay, well, this guy ain't going to get money if I didn't get money.
Yeah.
So you may have the greatest case in the world, but it's sometimes juries, they make decisions not based upon the facts, not based upon the law. And while somebody like myself can do whatever I can in my power to try to avoid that, it still happens. It's happened to me. Unfortunately, it's happened to me because I talked to jurors after the trial, and they base their decisions based upon things that have nothing to do with the facts of the case.
Yeah. And continuing on with the slam dunk coming apart, now with the jurors, we get into something like police reports, for instance. We've discussed that in previous episodes, that they could be incomplete, they could be completely wrong in a lot of cases, but then they carry a lot of weight with juries, it seems. So why does that happen?
Well, first, when a juror says, okay, I'm going to listen to what the police officer has to say, the police officer's testimony could be very powerful because that police officer doesn't have a dog in the fight. It's a completely independent witness. They're supposed to be independent, and they have a job to do. This is their job. This is their responsibility to report the accident as it happened. But what people don't understand is that sometimes police officers will make a report and talk about skids or talk about fault or talk about the angles of the cars or the speed, and these things aren't based upon fact or what the officer actually saw. It's more based upon physics, science, measurements, and sometimes they don't take the measurements. How do you know? You really got to investigate this. Sometimes they don't take a look at the length of the skid marks. You don't know. Sometimes they're saying, okay, yeah, it's just physics, but really, what physics principle is the police officer using? You don't know. So there's a lot that's up in the air. And just because a police officer writes it doesn't make it the law, it doesn't make it fact. It's just a conclusion that the police officer drew up. But it is fortunate or unfortunate that, the jury will not, sometimes they will not scrutinize these police reports as it should be. But when they do, and you're on the wrong side of the coin on that, well, your good case just fell apart and you're walking away with nothing.
You might have the classic, the left turn collision that always seems to be like the slam dunk for everybody, but even that could still, fault and blame could still be shifted onto the rider. So how does that happen?
Of course. Well, a lot of times, there's two sides to every story, as we say. So a lot of times what will happen is a motorcyclist will call me and say, look, I was just going straight, minding my own business, when a car made a left turn right in front of me and they had this horrible accident. Okay, well, first of all, they're going to say that the motorcyclist was speeding, and second of all, they're going to say the motorcyclist headlight wasn't working, and that's why I didn't see them. And they're going to also say that the motorcyclist really shouldn't have been in the lane that was closest to me turning, or the motorcyclist was showing off doing a wheelie. And all these things may or may not be believed by a jury because of the already inherent prejudice against motorcyclists. So you really have to be careful of that and do a great job in discovery, when you're litigating these cases, to make sure you flesh out all of the angles possible that could come at you at trial, so you are well prepared.
Serious injury, a catastrophic injury, something major, like you said in the beginning, could be considered a slam dunk. But why does that injury not automatically translate into the winning case or the slam dunk, as it were?
Because even if you have this huge injury, that doesn't mean that somebody has to be at fault for the injury. See, the problem is that some people, when you say that there was a motorcycle accident, they think it was just that, an accident, that no one is at fault. So some lawyers like to use the word collision so that it's something that takes away the word accident,
Yep.
and people don't think that there is any kind of blame because it was just an accident. It was just an accident. No use crying over spilled milk. right? But it's an accident to many people means that somebody did something wrong. But just because you have an injury doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else is responsible for your injuries. It could be just rider error. So that does not necessarily mean you have a slam dunk case just because you have a big injury.
All right, so let's pivot into some things that could really like unravel this thing for you. Let's start with crash scene photos, crash evidence. How could that inadvertently help the defense instead of your case?
Yeah, well, you really have to. I mean, it's always good to take photographs of the scene of the accident, but your adversary, or in this case, the driver of the car, or maybe another motorcyclist, hopefully not, but they're going to be taking their own pictures too. So they might take choice pictures of certain points of view of what they had, or make it seem like they, of course, they couldn't see the motorcyclist because the sun was going down. But in the meantime, 10 minutes before the accident happened and they took the picture, the sun was actually up. So, you really have to be quick about these things. Hire a lawyer as soon as you possibly can to get an investigator out there to actually do the measurements, to actually try to do the physics, get an accident reconstructionist if you need to. And, my law firm always does that kind of thing. And you can always find me, by the way, at ridingcounsel.com, ridingcounsel.com. You can call, you can email me, you can text me, whatever have you. And, I can always try to talk about these things going forward. But, it's very important that you get out there and you preserve evidence as fast as possible because these things tend to disappear. So let's say you had an accident, on a Monday and there were skid marks that really could be key to the case. Well, those skid marks actually could disappear because when cars drive over them, they tend to wear away. And when time goes by, maybe there's a snow, maybe there's a rain, they tend to wash away. So those measurements of skid marks, just for instance, get less accurate as time goes by.
Okay, eyewitness testimony, because we kind of misremember sometimes. How about that?
That's right. That's right. Eyewitnesses, like we were talking before, they some of them are more reliable than others. But just because somebody got a statement that says, "Okay, I got a statement from an eyewitness," and he says, the motorcyclist was at fault, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's the factor, and doesn't mean that it's the law. You have to check out, where was this eyewitness? Okay, and who is this eyewitness? And do they own a motorcycle? Do they know anybody who's owned a motorcycle? Because they're going to say, no matter what, that motorcycle was speeding. I don't think I've ever I don't think I've ever had a witness statement from the defendant that says that the motorcycle was not speeding. I mean, it just always happens. It always actually happens when witnesses say that the motorcyclist was speeding, and that's because of their point of view. The motorcycles are smaller and they have less of a profile, and they only have one light. So again, it's the time that it registers in these people's brains, the eyewitnesses, that lead them to say that the motorcyclist was speeding. So you really have to challenge these witnesses when they say something like that.
How could evidence that, because usually, like you said, right away, get somebody out there to measure? We're talking the first 24 hours is usually pretty critical. So evidence that's either collected or missed in that period, how could something like that unravel your case?
Yeah. So, if there's pieces on the road, of the vehicle, you really have to try to collect that because a defendant will repair their car really quick. And then you have zero evidence to say, no, I didn't take any pictures of it. I'm sorry. Oh, no, I don't have repair bills. I repaired it myself. And then you're left with basically nothing but the force it takes for something to break, maybe a bumper, maybe a tail light or a headlight or something like that on a vehicle. That becomes very important, especially for an accident reconstructionist, because it shows the force and the speed of the vehicle who actually hit you. So that is something certainly to keep in mind. And second of all, if they're going to somehow claim that the motorcycle was, the headlight wasn't working or something like that, well, it's very important that, you examine the motorcycle very quickly, because they're more likely to say that, well, yeah, you didn't examine the motorcycle for 6 months after the accident. You had so much time to fix it and so many other things could have been changed. Well, nothing changed, because if you examine the motorcycle within, say, 24 to 48 hours after the accident to prove that everything was in working order, that's pretty strong evidence that, the motorcycle light actually was being on. So, you really do have to act very quickly. I have some other podcasts about some great investigators that I use, and they actually do ride. So they know exactly what to look for in these cases. They know exactly where to look for things in the roadway, skid marks, other measurements, and you have to get on it right away.
My general bias, since we're on the subject, is whenever there's a vehicle interaction with police, I generally believe in the concept of shut your mouth. Don't say things. Because as you say, it can and will be used against you. I take that pretty seriously. But how could a rider's comments, like you say something just kind of in passing, you say it offhand at the scene, that can later get reframed, especially you're dealing with insurance and attorneys that are really good at this stuff. So I'm a proponent of keeping your mouth shut, but what say you?
So many times that this happens. A rider will be knocked off their motorcycle and everybody comes across to them. And the first thing they say is, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
And I'm kind of programmed to say, "Yeah, I'm okay." But even before I move, because, okay, I'm looking up at the sun and the clouds and the sky and I see people and I hear
Seeing
people.
pretty
So
colors
I'm
and stuff.
living. Yeah. So life is good, right? Yeah, I'm okay. So all of a sudden, you're going to get a eyewitness that says this guy was fine. He's making up the whole case. He said he was fine at the accident, but once the motorcyclist gets up and tries to walk, well, lo and behold, you have a broken leg or a knee with a tear in it that you can't walk, and you're not so okay. But things are relative when you say I'm okay. When the police officer comes over and says, "Hey, are you all right? How you feeling?" You're like, "Yeah, man, I'm glad to be alive. I'm okay." Well, okay. And now the police officers, guess what he's doing? Right. He's okay.
Glad
So
to
that's
be
going to,
alive.
yeah. And now, like, you have this thing that says, okay, well, the rider was fine at the scene of the accident. So I didn't call an ambulance. And now, because the police officer didn't call an ambulance, everybody thinks you're fine. And they try to minimize the case that way. So, you really have to be careful what you say, not only about how the accident happened, but your injuries. If you just got hit by a vehicle and you fell off your bike, this is not the time to start arguing about liability. He hit me, I'm going to fight you. None of that stuff. Okay. Just be just get yourself some medical care, get checked out, because you don't know what's wrong with you. And you may have back injuries, neck injuries. Get yourself checked out, and be thankful you're alive. That's fine,
Yes.
but don't just say I'm okay, because you're
Quietly think.
probably not. Yeah. Yeah. So
I
dude, keep
agree.
your mouth shut. Keep
Yeah.
your mouth shut.
Keep the mouth shut.
That's
All
right.
right. Helmets, protective gear, accessories, dash cams, go cams. How can that screw you over?
Man, so dash cams are great if they show, because they show exactly what happened, but it's a double-edged sword, because if you are the motorcyclist and you actually are at fault, guess what that dash cam is going to show. So it's also going to, just, you have to size up what evidence you have of your case, and you may or may not want to have other evidence besides that which you already have that shows a strong case. But some people feel quite the opposite, because what happens in motorcycle accident cases a lot, and people say, okay, I was faking it or something like that. They'll send out an investigator, and the investigator will videotape somebody who they think is faking it. And if you get that video and it actually shows you're injured, well, it's going to bite the insurance company in their butt. So you definitely got to be careful of that. And there's a whole host of things that you really have to be careful of, and it just takes careful planning. The best thing that you can do after an accident is just take care of yourself, make the call to a lawyer, and the lawyer will take care of everything from A to Z. They talk to your insurance company, they get your bills paid, they help you, they can even recommend doctors to you, and they do all the legal stuff. So it's best to just call a lawyer, hopefully that's familiar with motorcycle accident cases, so you can concentrate on getting better.
I would also assume that as the case goes on, not so much the immediate 24 hours, but months later, as this is all progressing, your social media can really mess you up too. You can really do yourself in, can't you?
Yeah, yeah. So I've had cases where it looks like it's a super strong case because this person just had an operation on their neck and their back, and they basically had their spine put together, and they were feeling pretty good. And I'm sitting there talking to the defense counsel and insurance company. I'm like, look, liability is solid. He's obviously got a really terrible accident, and this guy's going to be crippled for life. He's never going to ride a motorcycle again. About a week later after that, I got this nice CD. It was a beautiful movie of my client actually fixing his own car. He was actually on his back, wiggled under his car to fix something. I don't know what the heck it was. And then he went and like changed a tire on his car, and it just totally killed his own case. So, let's not be stupid out there, people. You're gonna kill your own case. So what really looked like a very strong case in the beginning really fell apart because nobody's gonna believe this guy.
So as we're wrapping up here, our general takeaway from all this. So what separates motorcycle cases that survive this jury scrutiny from the collapse? What should riders understand before the crash even happens?
You have to understand that you have to prepare for an accident, even if you're not in one, even before you get on the bike. Okay. First of all, I hate to say this, but you better have a lawyer already picked out because you want to make that call if you're in an accident. If you're ever in an accident, that should be one of your first calls. First, of course, call the police and get yourself some medical help, but then get a lawyer involved because they're the ones that are going to protect you. And you also have to remember to keep your mouth shut. Okay. Don't say anything stupid. But you also have to know that there's going to be some bias against you. Don't get hot-headed. Don't lose your cool because that's going to make you do and say things that really are not in your favor. Just let somebody who's experienced deal with this stuff because there is a lot of bias and prejudice out there that has nothing to do with the facts of the case, nothing to do with the law of the case, but will nonetheless hurt your case. So you really got to be careful and prepare yourself even before you get on the bike and before you're ever in an accident.
Yep.
So, but I think that's probably all the time we're going to have.
Yep.
We actually went a little over today, but I want to thank everybody for listening. Look, you can always get me if you ever have any questions about this stuff. You can always find me at ridingcounsel.com. I want you to like, subscribe, share. I really appreciate you guys listening. And, until next time, I want everybody out there to ride free, ride wild, but, do so legally. All right, everybody, you take care.
See you soon.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Riding Counsel with Richard Jaffe. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the ride, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your fellow riders. Until next time, keep the rubber side down and ride safe.